Alright, now we're going to move to the forgot password feature. So our user now is trying to log in, okay, but they forgot their password, so they will click on the forgot password link and they'll be asked to submit their email address. So once they click on the submit button, there will be an AJAX call which is going to be sent to the forgot password PHP file. So our AJAX call is going to be placed in the JavaScript file as we did earlier with the other AJAX calls, okay? And once the call is sent to this file is going to process the data, and if everything is fine, it's going to send an email to the user so that they can reset their password. So let's go ahead and create the AJAX call inside our JavaScript file. So it's going to be similar to the previous AJAX calls we created for the sign up and login. So I'm going to copy the login AJAX call and then adjust it, okay, for the forgot password feature. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the login call. There is something there. Send the data to the login.php file rather than sign up file. Okay. All right, so once the form is submitted, we're going to select the form using its ID. So if you remember, the forgot password form had an ID forgot password form. Okay. Okay, so let's use that. So we're gonna collect the user inputs using the serialize array method like that. And we don't need actually the console.log statements that we have here. We only did this for testing purposes, okay, and we can comment it in the other bits of our code, okay. All right. All right, now we're going to send the data to the forgot password file, or rather than the login file, like that. Okay, we're still using the post method, and if the call is successful, we're going to send an email to the user, okay, and there will be nothing returned by our PHP file, but we're going to return an error message if something goes wrong, okay, given that the AJAX call is still successful. Okay, so if there is any problem with the email or anything like that, then we're going to return an error message, okay, within our forgot password PHP file. So in that case, we're going to show that error message inside the error div, okay, inside our form, which is right there. Okay, so if the call is successful, we're going to select that div, okay, okay, like this. We're going to select it using its ID. So its ID is forgot password message. Okay, and then we're going to change its HTML content using the data variable, okay, which refers to whatever message is returned to us by the PHP file. Okay. All right, now we're done with the AJAX call, so let's save our file. Now let's go to the forgot password file and start writing some PHP code. So let's start with the PHP tags, okay, like this, at the beginning and at the end. Okay, now I'm just going to pause the video and just tidy up these comments, okay, to change them to PHP comments, okay. All right, now that looks better. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start a session, as we're going to be using some session variables later on. So again, to start a session, the function to use is session start. Okay. Then we're going to connect to the database, because we're going to be running some queries later on. So we're just going to include our connection file as we did before. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to check the user inputs, and from this point in our code, it's going to be very similar to the sign up code that we have written before. Okay. Similarly, we're going to define our error messages. Okay. And then we're going to get the user inputs, then clean them, and then run a query later on. Okay. So first, let's define error messages. We're going to have two possible errors. Either we get a missing email or an invalid email. Okay. And we're going to use exactly the same error messages we use for the sign up. Okay. So we're going to have missing email and invalid email. Let's just copy them from there. Okay. Now we're going to get the user inputs. So the only inputs we've got here is the email. All right. So let's use the same code we used to get the email in the sign up form. Okay, here we go. Okay, we just need to make sure that the name of the input is correct. Okay, so if you go to the forgot password form, the email field, okay, has got a name, forgot email. Okay, so let's change email to forgot email, like that. All right. We use the same name for our errors variable. Okay, so we did this step as well. So we're getting the email and we're storing the errors in the errors variable. Okay, now we're going to check if there are any errors. Okay, in that case, we're going to print an error message exactly the same way we did in the sign up form. Okay, so if there are any errors, we're going to print an error just like that. Now we can either go for an else statement, otherwise we can exit the code right there. And we're going to need to do exactly the same thing for the sign up code. It looks like I missed the exit function there, as I'm not using an else statement. So I'm going to do the same thing in our forgot password file. Okay. All right. Now, if there are no errors, we're going to prepare the variables for the query, and then we're going to run the query and do further checks. So to prepare the email for the query, we're going to do the same thing we've done over there. Okay. Like this. Now the query is going to check if the email does not exist in the users table. Okay, if that's the case, we're going to print an error message. Otherwise, we're going to get the user ID, create a unique activation code. Okay, and then we're going to insert the user details with the activation code in the forgot password table. Very similar to what we've done in the sign up code. So let's copy the code from the sign up file and adjust it for the forgot password feature. Okay, so here's our query. Okay, and then we're running the query using that statement, and then we're checking, okay, if there is any error running the query. And after that, we're looking at the number of rows inside our results variable. Okay, and if the number of rows is not 0, then we're going to echo an error message, okay, saying that the email address is already there. So that code was done for the username, but the code done for the email address was right after, okay. So I'm going to copy all that code like that, and then use it there, okay. Now we're going to print an error message if the email does not exist in our table. So rather than checking if results, okay, we're going to check the opposite of results, okay. So if the email does not exist, the number of rows is going to be 0, which means the opposite of 0 is going to give us true, okay. So now the error is going to be that email does not exist on our database, okay. And now we covered this step, okay. Now, if we skip this code, it means that the email actually exists on our database, okay? And then we can move to the remaining code and get the user ID, create a unique activation code, and so on, okay? Now, let's just change the name of this variable results to count, okay, to make our code easier to understand. All right. So if the email address exists, our count variable is going to equal 1, okay? Which means that its opposite is going to be false, okay? You can also change the condition of opposite of count. You can change this to count is different than 1, okay? You can use this as well. All right. Now, if the count variable equals 1, then we're going to land there. So to get the user ID, we're going to need to get the single record from our results object. Okay. So to do this, we're going to create a variable row and use the function mysqli underscore fetch array, okay, same function we used in the login file. So this function again is going to take a couple of parameters, our result object, okay, and we're going for an associative array, so we're going to use the option mysqli underscore associative like that, okay. So this is going to give us one record, okay, and if you look at the forgot password table, you'll see that that record is going to consist of a few elements, okay. So we're going to get the user ID, okay, and the other elements there. So now let's get our user ID. So we're going to create a variable user ID, okay, where we're going to store the value. So we're going to access our row array, and since it's an associative array, we can access elements using their keys, and the key corresponding to the user ID is user ID like that. Okay. Now we're going to create a unique activation code, the same way we did in the sign up file. Okay. So let's copy that code. Okay. Like this. Okay. Now we're going to insert the user details and activation code in our table. So we're going to create a record with the user ID, the key. So let's call the key key like this. Okay. The time, okay, so that's going to be the current time, so we can just create a variable time where we're going to store the current time using the time function. Okay, and the status is just going to be pending for now. Okay, so it's going to stay pending until the key is used. All right, so now let's create our query. So we're going to store it inside a variable SQL like this. Okay, so we're going to insert, okay, into our table, which is forgot password. All right, and then we're gonna have the following columns, and we're going to be inserting the following values, okay, inside those columns. So let's start with the names of the columns. So we're going to have the user ID first. Okay. Then we're going to have the key, then the time, the status, okay, and that's it. Now for the values, the user ID is going to be the user ID variable that we created earlier. Okay, the key is the key variable. The time is the time variable, and then the status is our status variable. Okay. All right, now let's run our query using the same code we used before, and we're going to store the results in the result object like that.